If you ever wondered what it would be like to combine fantasy storytelling with real life health and fitness, then in today's video, I'm going to walk you through exactly how I've been able to do that inside of Infitnite, the world's first fitness fantasy role-playing game that I dedicated the past 6 years building and delivering to warriors like you to transform their lives. I had a lot of inspiration from a lot of fantasy works like books, movies, and role-playing games, you name it, from Game of Thrones, The Lord of the Rings, to games like Final Fantasy, and even The Witcher. You know, fantasy has always been a strong part of my life. It's my favorite genre, but there's always what has been a struggle inside of Infitnite of how exactly are we connecting fantasy with health, wellness, science, and all this. And I wanted to answer that question because I finally figured out a way to do that. And I built a whole entire background foundational storytelling arc for you to really understand exactly how we do that. So let's dive in. So I'm calling this the world between worlds. This is exactly how the Infitnite world works. It starts with that moment that happens all the time in reality. It's this razor thin fraction of a second where two realities touch. Most people don't know this exists, but it's there. And I kind of can explain it as base reality and the celestial plane. You're experiencing base reality right now. That's exactly what you're experiencing. But base reality has moments that connect to what I call as the celestial plane. For example, in base reality, those are the moments where you're about to do your last rep in your workout. That moment where you're about to give up if you've been running for a long time. It's these fraction of a moment where you almost have like an out-of-body experience, where you suddenly generate the effort, the energy required for you to kind of push through. And in a way, you are connecting with another plane of existence. From a psychological standpoint, you're almost connecting with the future or your future possibility of yourself. So instead of thinking it from a time perspective, I want you to imagine that moment where you're tapping into the ultimate version of yourself. You're actually tapping into the celestial plane. Now, what's the celestial plane? Well, it's a membrane between worlds that radiates outward from your body, kind of like heat from a forge or crossing barriers that no ship or spell can traverse. On the other side is an astral being that opens its eyes. And here's exactly how the architecture works for Infitnite. First, we have the base reality, where the soul does its heaviest lifting. So this is everything that you're doing in the real world right now. Then there's an augmented layer. So this is like a lens that converts everything in reality into an RPG-like perspective. So this is what turns workouts into quests. This is what turns the reps that you're doing as damage towards monsters. This is exactly what happens when you level up from your workouts. That's the augmented layer. And then we have the celestial plane, like I mentioned before, which is the living destination of effort. Now, the celestial plane, I'm gonna dive into a little bit deeper in a moment. This is essentially our fantasy world. So this is how you're able to tap in to the fantasy aspects in terms of fighting monsters, becoming your avatar, that could be of a different race that doesn't exist in our base reality, like elves, dwarves, and so on. But beyond the celestial plane is the void. Now, this is where entropy presses inward. Now, this is the lifeblood of evil. So this is where darkness lives, and this is how it seeps into the celestial plane, where you then battle the evil. So the celestial plane is a culmination of good and evil, light and darkness, that whole dichotomy. It's the living existence of that we are able to cross into from base reality by leveraging also the augmented layer. And then beyond the void is the source. This is the primordial tension of existence. This is the beginning of all creation, light and darkness. So this is what surrounds all of these layers. So how does the augmented layer work with base reality? So base reality, like I mentioned before, it's the ground floor. It's everything that you're doing in reality in terms of your health and fitness. Now, the augmented layer is that arcane lens where you start to see and also convert things in reality into that RPG augmented reality. Like I mentioned before, when it comes to showing up to your workouts, you're not just going to work out, you're going to complete a quest. And by completing that quest, it gives you rewards like experience points. And you also have to overcome challenges. And the challenges may not always be with the weights themselves. There might be internal challenges, psychological challenges manifested into monsters. So we're not going to dive too deep into combat. That's going to be a whole separate conversation. But that is the essence of what we're doing. Everything that you do in base reality is visibly tracked with an RPG type of lens. Then there is the celestial plane. Now the celestial plane is made up of multiple world planes. And each one of these world planes, you can kind of imagine they're like different worlds that are interconnected. And each one of these worlds has, just like Earth, different places, different types of races that you would find in a lot of fantasy works. Elves, dwarves, and other races that I don't want to spoil, but they each have their own homeworld or celestial plane. And that's where what you explore in our world based on your avatar, which is a representation of yourself or extension of yourself from base reality into the celestial plane. And then there's that dichotomy of the source. Now the source, like I mentioned before, is a combination of light and darkness. And there's two beings that essentially are the highest in the hierarchy of the source in terms of the origination of the infinite world, and that's Luminara and Aethranox. Luminara is known as the Celestial Dawn, which represents expansion, growth, and the relentless insistence of infinite potential. Aethranox is the representation of darkness, entropy, seductive certainty that effort is unnecessary, where every act of surrender is a ripple of this eternal whisper. This is the battle between light and darkness, and that is the dichotomy of the source, which has a lot of psychological symbolism as well. That is one of the reasons why our celestial plane and that bridge between reality and fantasy begins. It starts with Luminara and Aethranox. Now, entropy at the margin. So the void is also very interesting because the void is not a place of fire and brimstone, it's a place of nothing. So it's almost like space. Once you go far enough in space, there's literally nothing. You know, we don't really know what it is. It's just kind of a way to kind of separate what is known and what is unknown, right? And until we cross that threshold of the unknown, we won't really find out exactly what's on the other side, right? And that is kind of why the source exists, is we know that there's something beyond the void, which is the source, but you know, this is what is kind of in between everything. So it fills the spaces left by abandoned routines and expired intentions. When a warrior's absence stretches long enough, corruption seeps through the weakened borders of the world plane. And the void does not send armies, it grows wherever effort recedes. So the void is the birthplace of all of those inner evils, and we experience those inner evils inside of the celestial plane. So these are the monsters that you're fighting. This is the birthplace of conflict, the manifestation of the struggle that you have, you know, the doubts that you have. Everything comes from the void. Now, magic is a very important part of this experience as well. Now, magic is essential for our fantasy world that we've built. And magic works like a flow. So everything starts with the initial input, which is the physical effort that you are experiencing in base reality. This is the sweat, the study, the connection, everything that you are doing with your health and fitness. That energy and that effort gets transferred in through a transmission system, which we call as the resonance bridge. And that data crosses the membrane. This is where we go back into what I was mentioning before, which is that augmented layer. That augmented layer translates everything that you're doing in base reality like an RPG. So that's where that RPG aspect comes in to the storytelling aspect of what we're doing. And that gets translated into or converted into what we call as Aether, which is just raw magical infrastructure. And that infrastructure is how you are able to access magic, experience magic, and also, you know, see magic in our world. This is how we are able to engage and learn to interact with magic. Then lastly, that magic gets converted into Ichor, and it's living magic which fuels your avatar. So your avatar, again, is a manifestation of yourself in our fantasy world, and it is powered by Ichor. And if you just go backwards, Ichor is created via Aether. Aether is created via the transmission of the actions that you partake in and perform inside the physical real world. So magic is not a passive mana pool, just like in a lot of just role-playing games, right? If you're trying to bridge reality and fantasy together, it has to be something that's driving this magical force, right? It is an infrastructure of the world generated exclusively by real exertion. Without effort, there is no Aether. Without Aether, the void fills the vacuum. So you can imagine the difference between magic and the void is nothing. So it's almost like it doesn't exist. So you can imagine that without this entire mechanism, you can't access magic, and it's just simply the void. So in order for you to access our world from reality, this is the process that it goes through. Then there is power. With a world full of magic, there has to be beings that are born in our world with innate magical abilities. But then there also must be those that know how to control magic and learn how to control magic. And there is absolutely a hierarchy of power in terms of magical abilities and being able to access it. So sorcerers have that innate power. They just are born with the power, with Aether essentially, and Ichor inside them, and they are able to access that magical ability naturally. It's very explosive, very volatile, and they're born with this raw magic soon by their own flame. They can either control this magic or let this magic control them. Then there are mages and enchanters. This is learned power, so it's structured and reliable, and it's mastered through study, repetition, and craft. So these are the beings in our world that have studied the art and the science of magic and to learn how to access its power. Then there are wizards. Wizards are the representation of earned power. Wizards may not have that innate ability to access magic, but they were warriors. So they've learned through mastery, and they've been able to access a level of power that no sorcerer or no mage is capable of, simply because of what they've been able to accomplish as a warrior in our world. And it's integrated mastery. It's discovered through the body what no book could teach, the highest integration of power that combines the blood, sweat, and tears of the physical growth and mastery with the study and learning of mages and enchanters over a long period of time, to the point where they are now wizards. Then last but not least, we have celestials. Celestials are the primordial power. They are the absolute law. They are the source of magic itself. They define reality. They are literally magic. They're born from it, they are access it, and they are literally aether, which is the lifeblood of magic in our world. For your avatar, your real world body and your avatar in our fantasy world is like two bodies but interconnected with one soul. So there's physical reality and that celestial plane. Your physical reality is tethered to your soul by a thread of resonance. An avatar sleeps inside. It is a projection assembled from every ounce of potential your biology carries, but your habits have not yet unlocked. Now, your avatar is dormant because it has never been fed. So you skip a session and the avatar stands motionless. The avatar is not a reward, it is a mirror. So it is literally a representation of yourself in reality. So you do nothing in reality, so will your avatar in our fantasy world. So you get stronger in reality, so does your avatar. Everything that you do is interconnected to your avatar. And that is how you are able to access our fantasy world in the celestial plane with your avatar. Now, briefly, I'm gonna go over the 4 dimensions of effort that your avatar must access to grow stronger, and that's combat, alchemy, intellect, and influence. Combat is the physical aspect, or your body in motion. Alchemy is the nutritional aspect, which is what fuels you and your avatar. Then there is intellect, which is the mental aspect, or your mind's architecture. And then lastly, there is influence, which is the social aspect of strengthening those around you. This is what completes the avatar, and you must train all 4 of these dimensions to truly unlock your potential and your power in our fantasy world. A gap in any of these areas creates a systemic vulnerability where the void will eventually find purchase and take you over. And then what makes up mastery? Well, that is where Valoryne's Trinity of Ancients comes in. Valoryne is an ancient Grandmaster Wizard, the first wizard of Infinite, who once was a warrior, who then became a magic wielder, who then ultimately became a Grandmaster Wizard once he took in disciples. If you want to learn more about Valoryne, I wrote 2 chronicles called the Chronicles of Valoryne that you can check out on our website completely for free. Feel free to dive into Valoryne and his development story of how he grew to become the Grandmaster Wizard on his warrior adventures. But he combined 3 particular areas: balance, consistency, and knowledge into mastery. Because power without balance is noise, effort without consistency is a spark that never becomes a flame, and strength without knowledge is a weapon swung in the dark. Mastery exists exclusively in the center of all of that. And that is just like with reality, right? You can't accomplish anything without consistency. And you also have to learn how to balance life, health, and fitness in all of those aspects that I just went over before in terms of the 4 dimensions of effort: combat, alchemy, and intellect. And that's all requires knowledge, right? It all requires learning, knowledge, learning from your mistakes, learning from others, and that's what makes up mastery. The end goal of what you do in Infinite is not battling a final boss. It's not achieving a maximum level. It's this never-ending journey of life where it's all about long-term transformational growth in all aspects. And the ultimate question is not just what am I, but what would I look like if I never stopped? That is literally in the name of Infinite. It's infinite growth. That's what we call as the infinite strive. You're striving for endless growth. You're pushing your limits. You're continuing to grow as you begin to age in base reality until the day you die, right? And I think that is a very important philosophy is in Infinite, it's not a matter of getting to a point and being okay, then regressing, right? Sure, we do practice gratitude. We do celebrate success and milestones. That's a huge, huge thing, but it's always going to be about, what is the next level for me? What's the next challenge? What's the next thing I can learn? What's the next thing I can accomplish? And that is a never-ending, constantly fulfilling journey that we believe Infinite can create for you. And the biggest takeaway, discipline is magic. That's the essence of the fantasy world that we've built, is we translate discipline into magic. What you do in reality has a direct connection with our fantasy world, and it all connects to discipline. So the strongest force in existence is not the swing of a blade, it is the decision to begin again. The bridge is open, so cross over. And that is just a little bit of the background of how I've been able to create a fantasy world that connects with reality in a way that makes sense, and also in a way that drives that connection forward into our fantasy world and also in reverse in reality, because what you do in reality has a direct impact in our fantasy world, and what you do in our fantasy world also has a direct impact with what you do in reality. And I believe we figured out a way to kind of do that with our layered reality system, and also our magic system and our avatar. So I hope you enjoyed this little breakdown. There's so much more fantasy storytelling to do, by the way. This is just an introduction for those that really wanted to figure out how it works, but there is going to be dedicated fantasy storytelling that I have to share with you in terms of deeper aspects of our world, what embodies our world, going deeper into the void and, light and darkness, Luminara and Aethranox. There's so much more to share with you. So if you enjoyed this, please head down to the bottom and share a comment. Share what you think is the most fascinating to you. What's the most intriguing? Which aspect do you feel like is super awesome, or, just share your thoughts on what you think might be confusing so I can provide more clarity in a future fantasy video. Also, feel free to consider subscribing for more fitness, fantasy, and role-playing game content and everything Infinite. And of course, I hope to see you in the celestial plane of Infinite as you build your avatar and crush it in reality so that you can transform and become the ultimate version of yourself. My name is Walt. I'm the founder, lead designer, and master wizard of Infinite, your guide by your side. Remember to conquer the day, warrior.